Tennessee, one of the few states in America that continued executing inmates by electric chair even into the year 2025. Although over 1,500 death sentences have been handed down in the state since 1976, only 14 people have actually been executed. So what led to 10 of them being chosen to die? In this video, you'll hear their final words, their last meals, and the brutal crimes that brought them to the execution chamber. One killed his own children. Another murdered his wife, then blamed someone else. One man set a car on fire with his girlfriend trapped inside as if trying to erase his past. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, what country or state. Let's see just how far these stories have reached. Now let's start with the first person. First, Oscar Franklin Smith. On the morning of May 22, 2025, the air inside Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville felt heavy and still. After nearly 5 years without an execution due to issues with the lethal injection protocol, Tennessee restarted its death machinery, and the first name on the list was Oscar Franklin Smith. He walked into the execution chamber at the age of 75. Dressed in a light gray jumpsuit, his wrinkled face showed no emotion. For some, it was justice long overdue. For others, it might have been an irreversible mistake. More than 30 years earlier, on an early fall night in 1989, Smith's ex-wife, Judith Robert Smith, and her 2 sons, Chad and Jason Burnett, were found dead inside their small home in South Nashville. All 3 had suffered severe injuries. Police never found the murder weapon, but a blood-stained ice pick was recovered at the scene. During the emergency call that night, a faint voice was heard yelling, "Frank." No, Frank was Smith's middle name and the name his friends used. At trial, prosecutors portrayed him as a bitter man, jealous, financially motivated, and enraged by his failed marriage. 2 co-workers testified that Smith had once asked them to help take care of Judith. And just months before the murders, he had taken out life insurance policies on all 3 victims. These scattered details were stitched together into a picture of guilt. Smith denied all charges. Over more than 3 decades, he filed dozens of appeals repeatedly requesting modern DNA testing. But the courts refused. In 2022, just hours before his scheduled execution, a last-minute stay was granted due to serious violations in the lethal injection protocol. But that was only a delay, not a pardon. As the execution chamber doors closed, Oscar Franklin Smith stood by his final statement. "I did not kill her. The justice system does not work." It wasn't an apology nor an excuse. It was a declaration of deep, enduring resentment. His last meal was a hot dog, French fries, and apple pie with vanilla ice cream, simple, everyday foods that stood in stark contrast to the complicated life he left behind. A quiet end for a name at the center of one of Tennessee's longest legal battles in modern history. Second, Nicholas Todd Sutton. On the night of February 20th, 2020, the air inside Riverbend Prison in Nashville grew heavy once again. Tennessee was preparing for its first execution of the year after nearly 12 months of pause. This time, the name called was Nicholas Todd Sutton, age 58. For many, the name Sutton evoked a past filled with darkness and blood. But to a few, he had come to represent redemption, a rare transformation within a system often seen as beyond repair. Nicholas Sutton wasn't sentenced to death for his original crimes. The event that led to his death sentence happened after he was already behind bars. But what brought him there had already shocked the public. In 1979, at just 18 years old, Sutton was convicted of 3 murders, including the killing of his own grandmother who had raised him. The other 2 victims were men connected to personal disputes reportedly involving money and broken relationships. He was sentenced to life without parole. But prison time didn't bury his violent past. In 1985, while serving time at Morgan County Correctional Complex, Sutton was accused of killing a fellow inmate, Carl Estep, a man tied to the prison's drug trade. Sutton claimed self-defense, but the court rejected that argument. He was sentenced to death, ending any hope of reintegration. And yet Nicholas Sutton's story wasn't one-dimensional. Over more than 3 decades on death row, he slowly became someone else according to those who witnessed it. They called him Nicky, not a killer, but a spiritual companion, a peacemaker among inmates, and someone who cleaned up chaos that could have turned into full-blown riots. 3 prison staff members wrote letters confirming that Sutton had once saved their lives in dangerous situations. One of them wrote, "If it hadn't been for him, I wouldn't be alive to tell the story." Many signed a petition for clemency addressed to Tennessee Governor Bill Lee, including not only prison staff, but also relatives of victims. But the letter failed to persuade. The state upheld the execution order. Before his final hour, Sutton requested Holy Communion bread and grape juice as a way to cleanse his soul. His last meal was far from extravagant: fried pork chops, mashed potatoes with gravy, and peach pie with vanilla ice cream. It was a humble dinner, just like millions of others across America, but in that moment, it became a symbol of peace before the end. His final words weren't an excuse. They were words of gratitude. "I am grateful to be a servant of God, and I look forward to being in His presence." He added, "Never underestimate the power of Jesus Christ to fix someone or a situation. So even in my death, I am a winner." The death of Nicholas Todd Sutton left lingering questions across Tennessee. Can a person truly change? And if so, how should the justice system respond to that change? Third, Leroy Hall Jr. In December of 2019, Nashville was cold, and darkness came earlier than usual. Inside Riverbend Prison, a device that had gathered dust for months was brought back into the light. The electric chair, a symbol of old-style executions. The man who would sit in it was Leroy Hall Jr., also known as Lee Hall, age 53. He never saw the chair. His eyes had gone completely blind from glaucoma during his years behind bars. In the execution room lit with fluorescent lights, he was the only one who couldn't see the light. Hall was sentenced to death for the murder of his ex-girlfriend Tracy Crozier on an April night in 1991 in Chattanooga. Their relationship had lasted for years but ended in bitterness. According to court records, Hall couldn't accept the breakup. After drinking, he confronted Tracy while she was sitting in her car outside a friend's home. The argument escalated. The car caught fire. Though rushed to the hospital that night, Tracy didn't survive. She died at the age of 22, leaving behind a shattered family and a haunting question: if Hall had stopped just a few seconds earlier, could the outcome have changed? Tracy's family never wavered in their belief that justice required a final end, and for what she endured, that end could only be death. But within death row, another image of Lee Hall began to take shape. He had gone completely blind from advanced glaucoma. His lawyers argued that executing a blind man was unethical, especially given reports that one juror in the original trial had held a personal bias against him. No court agreed to reopen the case. A clemency plea sent to Governor Bill Lee was denied. By law, because his sentence was issued before 1999, Hall was allowed to choose between lethal injection and the electric chair. Just days before the scheduled execution, he chose electrocution, a controversial decision. No one knows why. Maybe it was his way of reclaiming control over the final part of his fate, even if only by choosing that old chair. His final meal reflected who he was in that moment: simple, unpretentious, a Philly cheesesteak, onion rings, cheesecake, and a cold can of Pepsi. A Southern meal like so many others, as if he were reaching for something familiar, if not in life, then in memory. When asked for his final words, Hall didn't speak of himself. He didn't mention the crime or express regret. Instead, he left a message: people can learn to forgive and love to make this world a better place. The execution of Lee Hall closed a legal chapter nearly 30 years long, but it opened new debates. Should someone who has gone blind, who may have changed, still die in the name of justice? Or must justice also learn to see with the heart, not just by the letter of the law? Fourth, Stephen Michael West. On March 17, 1986, in Union County, Tennessee, a horrific crime shocked the local community. Stephen Michael West, age 23, and Ronnie Martin, age 17, broke into the home of Wanda Romines, age 51, and her daughter, Sheila Romines, age 15. Pretending to ask for money, the two men overpowered and kidnapped the mother and daughter. According to court documents, West and Martin took their victims to a separate location where the women were held captive and subjected to brutal acts. Sheila Romines was sexually assaulted before being killed. Both women died from sharp force injuries. Forensics later confirmed that the wounds showed signs of prolonged suffering. After the murders, West and Martin fled the scene. Their bodies were discovered by Jack Romines Wanda's husband and Sheila's father when he returned home from work. The scene was devastating, leaving the family and entire community in shock. Police quickly investigated and arrested both men the following day. In court, West was sentenced to death for 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of especially aggravated kidnapping, and 1 count of especially aggravated rape. Martin, being under 18 at the time of the crime, received a life sentence. Over the next 3 decades, West continued to appeal, claiming that Martin was the one who committed the actual murders and that he only participated in the kidnapping and assault. However, the courts rejected this argument, concluding that the evidence showed both men were actively involved in the crimes. Before his execution, West submitted a clemency request to Tennessee Governor Bill Lee, citing mental illness and a history of childhood abuse. The request was denied. Initially, West did not choose a method of execution, which meant he would receive lethal injection by default. But just 1 day before the scheduled execution, he changed his mind and opted for the electric chair, a legal choice for inmates sentenced before 1999. His final meal was a Philly cheesesteak and French fries. When asked for his final words, West said, "In the beginning, God created man." Then he began to cry and continued, "And Jesus wept." That's all. The execution of Stephen Michael West closed a long and painful chapter in Tennessee's legal history while raising lasting questions about justice, forgiveness, and the nature of capital punishment. 5th, David Earl Miller. On May 20, 1981, the city of Knoxville, Tennessee was shaken by a crime that stunned the local community. David Earl Miller, age 30, an Ohio native temporarily staying at a pastor's home, was accused in the death of Lee Standifer, a 23-year-old woman with an intellectual disability. According to court records, Miller and Standifer had only recently met. On the night of the incident, they had dinner and visited a public library, then returned to the pastor's house where Miller was staying. There, an argument reportedly broke out, leading to what prosecutors described as an act of extreme violence. Standifer was severely beaten and stabbed multiple times with a metal rod. Her body was found the next morning in the backyard, just steps from the pastor's bedroom window. Miller fled Knoxville that same night. After 9 days on the run, he was arrested in Ohio and extradited back to Tennessee to face a charge of first-degree murder. At trial, Miller did not deny his role in Standifer's death. However, his defense team presented evidence of a deeply troubled past. He had suffered physical and sexual abuse as a child and had a history of serious mental illness. Still, the court upheld the death sentence, ruling that the brutality of the crime outweighed any mitigating factors. Miller spent 36 years awaiting execution, longer than any death row inmate in Tennessee's history. During that time, he filed multiple appeals, including claims related to his mental health. All were denied. His final clemency request to Governor Bill Haslam was also rejected. Ahead of his execution, Miller refused lethal injection. Instead, he chose the electric chair, an option permitted for those sentenced before 1999. He cited concerns over the lingering pain caused by ineffective anesthesia in previous executions. David Earl Miller's last meal was a Southern classic fried chicken, mashed potatoes, a biscuit, and a cup of black coffee. When offered a chance for final words, he said only beats being on death row forever. It was a bitter remark, part sarcasm, part resignation. His execution on December 6, 2018, ended a legal journey nearly 4 decades long. But it also reignited deep debates about time spent on death row, the potential for rehabilitation, and the balance between justice and humanity in America's modern criminal justice system. 6th, Edmund Zagorski, on April 23, 1983. What seemed like a routine business deal turned deadly in a wooded area of Robertson County, Tennessee. Edmund Zagorski, age 28, arranged to meet 2 men, John Dale Dotson and Jimmy Porter, with the promise of selling them 100 pounds of marijuana. Both brought large amounts of cash expecting a quick transaction, but instead of a deal, they walked into a deadly trap. According to investigators, Zagorski led them down a remote trail far from phone service or passing cars. Instead of marijuana, he brought a gun. Dotson and Porter never made it out of those woods. For 2 weeks, their families lived in anxiety, filing missing persons reports and pleading with police to expand the search. In early May, the bodies of the 2 men were found in a decomposed state. Autopsies revealed both had died from gunshot wounds and showed signs of being assaulted with a sharp object. Police concluded the motive was robbery, and suspicion quickly centered on Edmund Zagorski. He was arrested in Ohio on May 26, 1983, just days after new evidence linked him to the killings. In his statement, he admitted to planning the ambush and targeting the men because he believed they were easy marks carrying cash. Zagorski's trial took place in early 1984. Prosecutors described the murders as a calculated betrayal, a robbery disguised as a drug deal. Due to the premeditated nature of the crime, he was sentenced to death on March 27, 1984. For more than 3 decades, Zagorski fought his sentence arguing that both lethal injection and the electric chair violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. He claimed that being forced to choose between the two amounted to unconstitutional coercion. Before his execution, Zagorski chose the electric chair, citing concerns over prolonged suffering caused by botched injections. He was legally allowed to make that choice due to his pre-1999 sentencing. His final meal was pickled pig knuckles and pigtails. When asked for his final words, he simply said, "Let's rock." On November 1, 2018, Edmund Zagorski was executed by electric chair at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee. He became the first person in the state to die by electrocution in more than a decade. His execution sparked renewed debate over the humanity of execution methods. 7th, Billy Ray Irick. On the evening of August 9, 2018, the execution bed at Riverbend Prison was prepared once again after nearly a decade of dormancy. The first person to be named for execution in Tennessee after 9 years without one was Billy Ray Irick, age 59. A name long associated with one of the most disturbing cases in Knoxville's history, dating back to 1985. Irick was a family acquaintance, often babysitting during emergencies. On the day of the incident, the parents of 7-year-old Paula Dyer left her in his care while they worked a night shift, a decision they never imagined would lead to irreversible loss. According to the investigation, just hours after the parents left, Irick called 911 in a state of panic. When paramedics and police arrived, they found Paula already dead with signs of severe injuries. The coroner concluded that she had endured prolonged suffering before her death. Irick was arrested at the scene. In subsequent statements, he alternated between admitting and denying responsibility, but couldn't explain why he called the police. At his 1986 trial, prosecutors argued that Irick's actions were especially heinous not only because the victim was a child, but because he had been entrusted with her care. His defense highlighted a history of mental illness and childhood trauma, including abuse. But the jury was not persuaded. Irick received the death penalty along with an additional 50-year sentence for related charges. For over 3 decades, Irick lived on death row, filing numerous appeals and requesting new psychological evaluations. His attorneys argued he had been mentally incompetent at the time of the crime. Some independent experts supported this, but higher courts upheld the sentence. Irick did not choose the electric chair. Under Tennessee law, he was executed by lethal injection, a method increasingly criticized by human rights advocates. During Irick's execution, witnesses reported signs of prolonged pain, reigniting debates about whether this method truly qualifies as humane. His final meal was a supersized burger, onion rings, and a cold can of Pepsi. When asked for last words, he spoke quietly, "I'm really sorry." And that's it. Billy Ray Irick was pronounced dead at 7:48 in the evening. His execution closed a legal saga more than 30 years long, while reopening questions about mental illness, responsibility, and whether lethal injection lives up to its intended image of humanity. 8. Daryl Keith Holton. On September 12, 2007, at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee, Daryl Keith Holton, age 45, was executed by electric chair. He had been sentenced to death for killing his 4 children on November 30, 1997. Holton was the first person to be electrocuted in Tennessee since 1960. A Gulf War veteran, Holton returned to Tennessee to a life marked by emotional instability. Following a drawn-out divorce and custody battle, the court granted full custody of the children to his ex-wife. Holton was allowed scheduled visitation, but according to court records, he felt increasingly shut out from their lives, a feeling that experts later described as a key psychological trigger. On the morning of November 30, 1997, Holton arranged to meet his 3 biological sons and his ex-wife's daughter, a child he had also raised under the pretense of buying Christmas gifts. But instead of taking them to a mall, he brought all 4 children to a garage in Shelbyville where he worked part-time. There, he used a semi-automatic rifle to take their lives. The act occurred in isolation with no witnesses. Immediately afterward, Holton drove to the local police station and turned himself in. His full confession was recorded within hours. He made no attempt to flee and never denied responsibility. This was one of the rare death penalty cases in Tennessee where the defendant surrendered right after the crime and refused to appeal the sentence. At his 1999 trial, Holton did not contest the charges and waived further appeals. His defense team argued that he suffered from major depressive disorder and passive-aggressive personality disorder. But the jury rejected this, sentencing him to death for all 4 counts of first-degree murder. Holton chose the electric chair, a rare choice in an era dominated by lethal injection. He declined a special last meal and instead ate the standard prison dinner: pork ribs, salad, baked beans, white cake with icing, and iced tea. When asked for his final words, Holton simply said, "I do." His execution stirred controversy over the use of the electric chair and the potential for reform in severe cases. Some of his relatives, including Reverend Tim Holton, publicly opposed the execution and called for forgiveness. Daryl Holton was buried beside his 4 children at Simpson Cemetery in Eagleville, Tennessee. 9. Sedley Alley. In the early hours of June 28, 2006, at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee, Sedley Alley, age 51, was executed by lethal injection. He had been sentenced to death for the murder of Lance Corporal Suzanne Marie Collins, a 19-year-old U.S. Marine, in 1985. This case has become one of the most controversial examples of possible wrongful execution in U.S. criminal justice history. On the evening of July 11, 1985, Suzanne Collins was abducted while jogging near the Millington Naval Base. Her body was later discovered in a nearby park. Sedley Alley, a former Navy veteran, was arrested after 2 Marines reported seeing a vehicle leaving the scene. Alley initially denied involvement but later confessed to the crime. He later recanted, claiming the confession was coerced and inaccurate. In his 1987 trial, Alley was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death along with additional 40-year terms for kidnapping and aggravated rape. Throughout more than 2 decades of appeals, he and his legal team repeatedly requested DNA testing on physical evidence from the crime scene, including a pair of men's underwear and other items, in hopes of proving his innocence. However, the courts denied the requests, stating there was no reasonable probability the results would alter the verdict. After his execution, Alley's daughter, April Alley, continued efforts to test the DNA to uncover the truth. In 2019, she filed a petition with support from the Innocence Project asking for posthumous testing of preserved evidence. The court denied the request, ruling that his estate lacked the legal standing to pursue DNA testing after death. The case of Sedley Alley ignited widespread debate over the refusal to test DNA in capital cases, raising critical questions about wrongful executions. In 2011, the Tennessee Supreme Court reversed its stance and allowed DNA testing against national criminal databases, a move that, if made earlier, might have offered Alley a chance to prove his innocence. For his last meal, Sedley Alley requested pizza pockets, ice cream, oatmeal cookies with sugar glaze and milk. His final words were directed to his children. Yes, to my children. April, David, do you hear me? I love you. Be strong. He also thanked the prison chaplain and repeated, I love you, David. April, be good, stay together, be strong. The execution of Sedley Alley remains one of the most cited cases when discussing the risks of executing the wrong person and the critical role of DNA testing in the pursuit of justice. 10. Philip Ray Workman. In the early morning hours of May 9, 2007, at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee, Philip Ray Workman, age 53, was executed by lethal injection. He had been sentenced to death for the killing of Lieutenant Ronald Oliver during a robbery in Memphis in 1981. Workman, a former member of the U.S. military, led a troubled life after leaving service battling drug addiction and criminal behavior. On August 5, 1981, he attempted to rob a Wendy's restaurant in Memphis. During his escape, he was accused of fatally shooting Lieutenant Oliver. But over time, new evidence and testimony cast doubt on whether Workman actually fired the fatal shot. A key witness from the original trial later recanted, admitting he had lied under pressure and for personal gain. Additionally, forensic experts suggested that the wound Lieutenant Oliver suffered did not match the caliber of Workman's weapon, but may have come from another officer's gun. 5 of the original 12 jurors signed statements declaring they would not have voted for conviction if they had known this information. In his final days, Workman asked that his last meal be given to a homeless person in the form of a vegetarian pizza. Though the request was denied, word spread, and hundreds of pizzas were sent by local residents to shelters and unhoused individuals across Nashville, honoring his final wish. Just before his execution, Workman said, I commend my spirit into your hands, Lord Jesus Christ. He was pronounced dead at 1:38 in the morning. The execution of Philip Ray Workman left behind a legacy of doubt about truth, justice, and whether the American legal system can afford the risk of executing someone who may not be guilty. 10 people, 10 executions, 10 stories thick with darkness where crime, pain, and justice collide. But after each execution, what lingers is more than a name. It's the questions that never fully fade. Is justice ever truly complete? Can people change? And if they can, where do we draw the line between forgiveness and accountability? Each case in this list is a chapter marked by the fingerprints of a legal system, at times unflinching, at times uncertain. One thing is certain, the pain never disappears. But how we choose to face it will shape the future of our society. What do you think about the death penalty? About justice? Leave a comment below, not just your opinion, but your honest reflections. And if you want to keep exploring untold stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because somewhere in the shadows of history, a truth is always waiting to be seen again.